to give ourselves this kind of split by which we can obtain more full vision, as in, for instance, Leo Strauss is saying that it's impossible to study the West without both Athens and Jerusalem, because otherwise we can't see the air we're breathing because there's nothing to contrast it with. So for that reason, and it's also suggested in some lectures with Leo Strauss, for instance, there's one where there's a Chinese student present where he mentions that Heidegger, if one read him closely, is often making allusions towards possible détente, not to say a rapprochement with China and Chinese thinking. China, where to go into it, we'd have to get into the concept of nature in the West and in China, and whether even one can speak of this sort of elementary Gedanken or thought as something which is somehow there in both, or what we're doing when we make that kind of comparison. But first, before we go to that, I wanted to give some sort of double vision also to Dasein by comparing it again with some Nietzschean thinking. This lecture, there's a lecture that's recommended by some top thinkers in the Nietzsche Society, Babich, and carried out at Columbia Law School, which is another point of Cantor Infinity. Again, if we were going to why are the law schools now becoming major sites of these philosophical investigations. That is so also in Harvard Law School, notably. So the lecture is called something like Nietzsche 1313, and the one on Heidegger is Nietzsche 113. Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche. So we have one speaker there that gives an interpretation of Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche's, as he shows it, the split between the eternal return and the will to power. I believe it's in agreement with my interpretation, which my interpretation is based only on the second essay from the Thoughts Out of Season on the use and abuse of history. It's essentially stems from that. I don't try to make an interpretation of the other text. I've read the other texts, but actually not very recently. I've read only snippets of them recently. But I mainly draw my interpretation from this work, which we're saying is from the immature period, going by Strauss's division, where he says Nietzsche came to maturity very late, especially compared to many other thinkers. There, what the speaker does is he says that it is, he identifies with that something is rather than what it is, the something as that rather than the something as what, connected by the copula, is. He identifies the that with the eternal recurrence of the same, for the reason, so far as I understand it, for the reason that, this is the speaker giving Heidegger's interpretation, which, so far as I understand it, all the lecture series are the material that went into those four volumes of the Nietzsche books. Which I've read, but I don't remember I haven't looked at the specific passages on the interpretation of eternal recurrence of the same anytime recently. The way he interprets Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche is, so far as I understand it, that that it is eternally recurs. So we have this standing something, which then is connected by the Kabbalah to the predicate, or to the what, or to the announcement of. You see how all these things, which are not exactly the same but overlap in some way, are in some way agree, or some way correctly can be put in the second something, the teleology, and so just as much also the noumenum in Kant, especially, and in actually especially that. And then, of course, if we were to look at it closely, if we were to look at how it stands in the whole system of Kant, then all kinds of questions come up. I still think that there's, so far as the noumena are a negative concept, and Kant specifically speaks of them in that way, I'm not sure, but I still think that it makes some sense to say, this just as an aside, that Schmidt is using the same brand of thinking, this Kantian thinking of the negative of the negative concept of the noumena, of when he thinks of the so-called quote-unquote limit concept of the political. Now, the limit concept could refer to other thinking, and other thinkers have this. It could. Schmidt may be dealing with other things, and I don't know about it. But I still think that's plausible in lieu of further evidence. So the will to power. So we have on the first side with the first something, eternal recurrence. So the eternal recurrence of the that it is, the first something. On the other side, the will to power as constantly establishing what I've been calling the motive, the continued motive. But the motive just means almost the same thing as the teleology, what the thing is supposed to come to in its maturity, holding that teleology in place. I've been especially drawn to go into this. So we have the something is something again. It's a simple formula. Something, just to reiterate, something, eternal recurrence, as something, the second something, will to power. Something that, something what, something, the mere thing there, something that which is predicated about it, that which it's all about. Something, ousia, something, the high teleology in its perfection, etc., etc. Something, the phenomena, something, the noumena. One thing that drew me into approaching this is how it can be woven into the current world situation, which is that when we see, for instance, in this issue of the holding doors open for women, for instance, as one example of, let's say, a conservative attempt to conserve the old way of life, which would be susceptible of various approaches. For instance, that one can say, this is the right way of life, full stop. But one could also say, make all kinds of other rationale for why it's better to do things that way. It could become a humanistic argument, for instance. It's better to do things that way. One could point to natural law in the sense that this is God's order in some way. One could point to all kinds of reasons behind that. But if you look at it from the Nietzschean point of view, then this desire to hold these two things together, that there's men and women, that the men and women simply are, in the sense of eternal recurrence, that they are, but then also how they are supposed to behave, what form of life they're supposed to have through the will to power, constantly willing that they should behave in this way, that the das Sollen, the ought, that which is behind the noumena, that the will is in this place of the ought. The ought is the thing that Kant leaves unthought and never questions in his whole philosophy. So we have a prolonged. To finish this thought, you can see that if there's a part of the population that's trying to will ends, as it were, certain teleology, certain natural points of maturity, certain points where this is, to give the old metaphor, you have in nature there's an orange tree, and but if you try to grow that orange tree in along the Danube River somewhere, it's too cold and it won't grow well. So you need an orangery. You need a house, a hothouse to grow it in. But if you give it the right conditions, then the perfect fruit comes out. If you give it the wrong conditions, the perfect fruit doesn't come out. So then you have this standing forms of human beings, men, women, and then you just the form that they are to live. For instance, in opening doors for the woman, this may be a form that's like the Orangery. In other words, this is the form that makes that being come to its perfection. So you could see that in the current situation, there's an attempt to, from this Nietzschean point of view, for the will to power to insist on these forms being perpetual and constant. In that sense, only because somebody's willing it to be so, rather than pointing to, because for Nietzsche, citing Bartold Niebuhr, these are all accidental forms that have simply befallen us because of history, where we are in history. One doesn't need to start with the Nietzschean point of view, as is readily clear. We could start from the Catholic perspective or from other perspectives. But there's something in that, in certain aspects of the current, there's something in Nietzsche's way of understanding the eternal recurrence and the will to power that can be applied to an analysis of the current situation, I believe. This becomes very vexed when you look at it from Heidegger's point of view, because Nietzsche is not trying to establish something in academe. He's not. He's much more playful than that. He regards what he's saying more like a myth, and even when he calls it a myth, in speaking of myths, he's using a metaphor by his own understanding. Everything is much more like what he says about being itself. It's the last wisp of some vaporous thing. Whereas Heidegger wants to lay things down in a much greater exactitude for thought and to preserve them. Again, to mention what Jasper said, maybe you, Heidegger, can rescue these things for us and bring them to where all of us can find these things which were just sort of half dreams and just only on the edge of the consciousness of Nietzsche, and bring them into, domesticate them almost. So there's that on the way to, and I think this also shines some light on the incredible power of this basic something is something form, which also in some way we can even understand Dasein according to that, and understand the copula. One last thing I'll mention is that although, and it comes up, I got this originally, this theme I got from one of Strauss's lectures, which is that ancient Hebrew does not have a word for is in the sense of a copula. So there is a word for existence in some way, but there's not a word for is as a copula in a sentence in the way we make the tree is red, the tree grows upward, and so forth. There's only there's the form that appears in the famous passage of "I am what I am," which is largely viewed to have been transformed through a philosophical reading. And that form is, as I have been informed, is used thousands of times every day in Israel, but that's because, of course, with the revival of the Hebrew language, many changes were made, including making this ancient word into an everyday word where it can be used as a Kabbalah. But it wasn't used that way in the ancient text. So therefore, Strauss concludes that being in this sense is not coextensive with the human being. The word being is not coextensive with human beings. Human populations existed without that word. So that is also, if we could access the societies that don't have that word, then there's a contrast there. And presumably China is one such one. One text I would recommend in connection to the gist of China with the modern situation with the West is this text, which is somewhat eye-opening. It's by an author called Lovejoy, called "The Chinese Origins of Romanticism."